Uh,
Hello, Nachum.
Hi, David.
Hi. It's a pleasure to have Nachum Kaplan with us today on our Guerre and Shalom special podcast. We've only just shared his amazing new article on why the news media is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and it's been very, very popular. In fact, it's been our fourth most popular by reactions of all time. But unlike all our other most popular ones, this one is 5,500 words. So people have sat down, read it in detail, and shared it. And in that, we see some positive news for the future of journalism, which is, of course, the purpose of our talk. So, Nachum, could you just tell us a little bit about your background in the media and perhaps how you became interested in this particular topic of anti-Israel bias?
Yes, certainly. Well, as your viewers could no doubt hear, I'm an Australian, which is where I began my career working on a daily newspaper there called the Herald Sun, which is Australia's biggest selling daily newspaper. I moved up to Indonesia from there because I was a language student. And I worked for an Indonesian newspaper, and I worked for many years as a foreign correspondent in Indonesia during the Indonesian Revolution in 1997-98. So that was exciting. Then I moved from there to the UK. I worked in London for 6 or 7 years, doing maybe or mainly business news, financial news, that kind of thing. Then I moved to Singapore, which is where I am now. Some well, I guess 16 or 17 years ago now, but in that time, I have traveled everywhere for my work. I've been to Europe, the Middle East, the US, repeatedly. So I've kind of been all over. I've been interested in journalistic ethics since I became a journalist. So when you do your training, it's kind of one of the things that they used to hammer into us. I'm not sure that they still do in
Mm.
the same way. So I've sort of watched the ethics of journalism change from the inside over that time. And the Israel story has been part of that, but not exclusively that. We see it in other domains as well. And then after October 7 happened, I wasn't surprised by the media response, but I was surprised by the scale and intensity of it. Um, I knew it was bad. I didn't appreciate that it was that bad. Um, so that's really when I started writing my moral clarity newsletter. I just felt that I had to do something. Um, Although I'm a secular person, I have a very Hebrew name. So for people like me, I can't hide. If once they see my name, they know who I am, and I get the corresponding amount of hate that I would get as if I was wearing a kippah. So I take it personally as well.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, you say that there's been, it wasn't October the 7th that caused you or was a big inspiration for you writing the newsletter. It just makes me think, so according to some people, it's always been so that there's no Jews, no news, and that anti-Israel bias in the media is perennial. So do you think it's a perennial problem? And this is just a continuation, or do you think it's been a particularly bad since October the 7th?
It's been particularly bad since October 7, and it's been particularly bad probably in the decade before it. I think if you go back to when I began my career, coverage of Israel was more mixed. And the main thrust, particularly in the British press, so back then the United States was very clearly aligned with Israel, and the media there reflected that. The UK media seemed a little bit more partial, or but their big focus was the amazingness of Israel, like just the sheer invincibility as they saw it of the Israel Defense
Mm,
Forces, the victory in the
mm,
Six Day War. It's just, oh, it's amazing. And that was the focus rather than the politics of it. Um,
mm,
but then slowly over time, it has built up and it kind of shifted to the nadir we are at now. October 7 didn't create it, it exposed how bad it had become. That's
Mm.
how I would frame it.
Yes, I mean, for me, I would perhaps put things all the way back to the Second Intifada when
E-
Israel did all of these peace efforts, and yet it was thrown back in her face with the Second Intifada. But instead of seeing that as a kind of violent response to a peace effort, it was seen as all caused by one man having a wander on a mountain. Now, of course, someone can have that view, but the idea that that becomes a mainstream position, that shows that people weren't willing to give Israel the benefit of the doubt, but
Mm,
also that there was a kind of victim mentality that we're going to judge how good a country is by its suffering. So, it may be the case that if Israel suffered more deaths than Palestinians, people would be more sympathetic towards Israel. It's possible, but it seems today that we are in a competition of suffering, and that's a kind of a change as well. Um, let's talk a little bit about the war in particular. I mean, you mentioned something kind of obvious, but it's so obvious that I never noticed it before, which is that people, journalists aren't really reporting from Gaza, are they?
there are
Could
no
you could you could you expand on that? And where are they actually getting their information from?
So there are no foreign journalists in Gaza, absolutely none. The only way that you can be a journalist in Gaza is if you are embedded on a tour with the ADF. Those tours tend to be anywhere from 3 hours to 9 hours, so they're not very long. It's not like they're, following an Israeli battalion around for a week or anything like that.
Mm,
The only other way you could be in there would be to be a member of Hamas, um, which of course none of them are. And even if they were, Hamas is quite a ruthless dictatorship, and you would not be able to report honestly, even if you
mm,
wanted to. So where is the
mm,
information coming from? It is coming from Hamas itself. So what most newspapers have, on the ground in the Palestinian territories is essentially stringers. So for those who don't know, a stringer is a part-time journalist or photographer that you call only when you need them. Yeah,
okay.
only when you need it, but they're not permanently part-time. Now, these stringers basically moonlight as a variety of other things when they're not feeding news to foreign media. And the main thing that they pose as, or not, no, they pose as journalists, they're really Hamas terrorists.
Mm.
Um,
So there's no credibility with them, but then it raises the question is if one wanted to get reliable information, where would it be possible to get it from?
I don't think that it is possible.
Mm,
You could, well, one side is not going to trust the ADF accounts of things, although I think
mm,
ADF accounts are certainly not perfect. The ADF do censor what comes out as well, but it's more reliable than the pure fabrication that comes out of the Hamas side. And the other problem on the Hamas side is that Hamas is a governing institution. So, doctors
mm,
are Hamas members, people who work for government departments that sound relatively benign. I'm in charge of the water system. They're a Hamas member, and there is no real distinction between Hamas and the government of Gaza. And we can have a fight about how much of a distinction there is between the people of Gaza and
mm,
Hamas. The other source of information is people working for the UN and people working for non-government organizations who are still in Gaza because they've been on the ground since and they've been involved in shipping aid into Gaza and those kinds of things. And that is no better than the people who work for Hamas. Um, for 20 years or since Israel pulled out, these people have been providing infrastructure advice, aid, technical advice, everything else to Hamas. They are part of Hamas. They are indistinguishable from Hamas. I would argue in the most extreme cases, those that are not indistinguishable are highly sympathetic to Hamas. They have the Hamas view of the world. So I don't think, truth be told, there is a way to get the
mm,
definitive, objective facts out of Gaza right now. What we can do is just be really skeptical where it matters. So when we say that there's been this number of casualties, and we ask, well, is that from a credible source?
Mm.
And this gets written in the media, according to the health ministry
Yes.
or according to the Hamas health ministry, which kind of suggests that Hamas is some kind of legitimate entity when it's not at all. They don't
Mm.
say, from the caliphate seeking murderers, Hamas, which
Mm.
would be entirely accurate. And
Yeah.
that makes Hamas look like a legitimate source when they're absolutely not.
But
So
how about in recent days, the British media have been reporting about surgeons, British surgeons who have been working in Gaza. How would you judge their credibility in that they are not Gazans, they are medical officials who presumably want to help the lives of people suffering. So how would we rate that as a source?
I would rate it terribly as a source, and I would just point out that of all professions, doctors joined the Nazi Party in Germany in higher numbers and more quickly than any other profession.
Mhm.
So the idea that just being a professional, and we know that doctors are the aristocracy of white collar jobs in the West, right? If you're a
Yes, of
doctor
course.
and all those
Mm.
kinds of things, um,
Mm.
but they are just as capable of being racist and anti-Semitic as everyone else. The world is a big place. There's lots of suffering they could go to. The fact that they have chosen to be in Gaza, as opposed to any other number of places, is indicative that they care unusually about this particular conflict.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's move on to that then, seeing as you've raised that point. You state in your title that the news media is anti-Semitic. So just to push back on that and just to see what you would say, I mean, definitely from our perspective, they are anti-Israel. They are believing the death figures of jihadists or even the UN, who, as we've seen in recent days, are making up figures. So there's no question about that in my mind. But one could say the fact that they are obsessed about Israel, as you've just alluded to, means they are not obsessed in any way about the manifold conflicts, for example, in Africa, the genuine and widespread starvation happening at this moment in Sudan, the fact mentioned in your article, the shocking fact that there's been basically a First World War going on in Congo, an equivalent as the First World War with a multi-nation conflict where you have possibly over 5 million deaths and it hasn't been reported. Now, you could look at this two ways. You could say they're obsessed about Jews and they're placing all the emphasis on Jews, or you could say they don't care at all about the lives of Africans or Indonesians, as you said, or other people. So are they being anti-Semitic, or are they rather more being anti-African? Where would you put the blame? Now, you might say both, but but what do you think is the object? What try and expand upon that? Where is the prejudice greater here?
Okay, so it's the difference between being indifferent to something and actively hostile to it. So
Mm,
I think they are indifferent to many of the other world's conflicts. I
yeah.
don't think they actively dislike one party or another in it. Whereas I do think they actively dislike Israel. They're not just indifferent to it. That's the distinction I would draw. But you are, absolutely correct that the media does in fact ignore all sorts of these things. I can remember as a very young journalist working on the world desk on a newspaper in Australia, and you see all the world come in, and there really is. We used to joke. I use in my article. I talk about a sliding death scale, right?
Yes.
That's something that we used to call it to and we would laugh about it largely as a coping mechanism because a
Mm,
story would come in, and if you're on a world news desk, it's just terrible news from all over the world, and after a month you're really depressed about things. You can't do it for
mm,
long. um
yeah.
you really can't. It's very bad for your health.
Yeah.
It was like 60 dead in India bus crash. Oh yeah, one paragraph. Right, so there's sort of 60 lives gone. Meanwhile, on the front page, there's some celebrity cheating scandal.
mm,
This is kind of the first thing. Well, there really is a sliding death scale, and we saw that more recently in if you look at how much coverage Palestinian deaths get versus most people can't tell you how many Israelis have died in this war.
mm,
Everyone can tell you there are 50,000 dead Palestinians. Nobody can tell you, or very few people can, unless they follow it closely, because it's not reported in every story. So the media is kind of putting a premium on one side's
mm,
deaths, and
mm,
and a discount on the other. Whereas basic good journalism would just be a paragraph saying there have been X number of Palestinian deaths and X number of Israeli deaths since the war began, and it would just be a matter of record there. Um,
mm. But do you believe, let's just imagine something. Let's imagine that more Israelis were dying than Palestinians. Would they then be more sympathetic towards the Israeli side, but they're just what they care about is death figures. And also, I mean, they obviously don't, they're not distinguishing, we don't know what the death figures are, and we're not distinguishing here between
we have no idea, right? If we're honest.
terrorists
Yeah.
or even combatants and civilians and all the rest of it. But what I'm trying to say is it anti-Semitism or is it just an obsession with suffering and emotion over reason and context and strategy? And that's why I'll repose the question, because in this conflict, a mention of Israeli deaths, while, as I say again, in Sudan, mass starvation meets with total silence.
Yeah, it's an interesting question when you frame it that way. I believe they are anti-Semitic. I don't give people the benefit of the doubt.
Mm,
If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, squawks like a duck, it's not a social construct of a duck. It There is
mm,
such a thing as ducks, and there is such a thing as anti-Semites. So I believe they are anti-Semitic. And would they be more sort of sympathetic to Israel if the death tolls were reversed? Uh,
mm,
Maybe, but not necessarily. I mean, there are, as we've just discussed, there are large numbers of places with much larger death tolls that get no interest at all. So there isn't any reason to think that it's just the death tolls that gets their
yeah,
attention. It's
yeah,
the
that's a
involvement of a
good point.
Jewish state.
No, that's a good point. Now, in Nigeria, there were cases of kidnappings, and there were certain resonances a little bit on of October the 7th with the kidnapping of school children in Christian school children in northern Nigeria. Now, that's a conflict which, well, it did actually get some coverage from celebrities and Michelle Obama and so forth for a very short amount of time. But my question is this. I'm not quite sure what's going on that's my fault, but I'm not that sure what's going on now with hostages in Nigeria. And I suppose the question is this, is the spotlight on the Middle East by the media making it even less likely than it otherwise would be to come to some kind of peaceful arrangement? Or does the complete ignorance of the world, including myself, about northern Nigeria show that even if the media's not there, it's just as unlikely, or perhaps more unlikely, not to be solved, because at least with Israel, there's some kind of American interest, whereas there is none in Nigeria. Is the media spotlight a blessing or is it a curse?
I actually think it's neutral in terms of the dispute. I mean, I believe that the dispute is fundamentally one between civilization and medieval barbarism,
Mm,
by which I'm talking about is Islamism and jihadism and that particular strain of Islam.
mm,
Are these people mean what they say?
mm,
These things are not just rhetoric, which is carried away. I mean, history shows us when people say they want to kill Jews, they mean that they want to kill Jews. There seems a refusal in the West to accept that at face value, no matter how many atrocities happen. So
mm.
I think it's fairly neutral. I don't think these sort of religious fundamentalists whose concerns are celestial
Yes.
The media manipulation for these people is not making it better or worse. They see it as a tool that they can use. And it's a tool that they use
Mm.
incredibly well, and it's a tool that Israel uses incredibly poorly.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Um, Now we've talked a lot about earlier about Gaza and the journalists, they're not really reporting inside Gaza. Something else you said, which again is one of those obvious facts that are not obvious until they're pushed in your face, was that these journalists who are not reporting from Gaza are reporting drinking cappuccinos in Tel Aviv. And they're enjoying their life. That's why they're there. Because if or they like Bangkok, you said, and they like Tel Aviv, and they used to like Beirut before Hezbollah. So journalists like reporting from certain places, and that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of news from Israel. But what strikes me, and I'm interested in your view, is are they aware of the irony at all of the fact that they live somewhere because they like it, but they don't like it? They're living somewhere where if they are gay, they can live freely being gay, but they're supporting another place down the road where they can't. So there's a definite dissonance there. I mean, I don't want to tar all journalists with the same brush. For example, Isabel Oakeshott from the Daily Telegraph, who in Britain, which is kind of a more a pro-Israel approach. She was in Tel Aviv. She was on her East scooter. I don't know if she saw this. She fell off on the promenade, injured herself. So she went to hospital in Israel, and she was so impressed with the treatment at the hospital that she wrote a piece in the how much superior the Israeli medical system was to the NHS because of the treatment and the robots and whatever she was using. So let's not tar everyone with the same
And, and
brush.
the and the Israeli
But
Arab staff, I might add.
and the Israeli staff. She did a great article about that. So let's not say everyone's like that, but as a whole, are they not aware of this dissonance?
No. So it's definitely cognitive dissonance. Now, we all need a degree of cognitive dissonance, right? We all have a degree of it, and we all need a degree of it. You might
Yeah.
think that there's a clash of civilizations coming and there's going to be the mother of all wars, or you might think there's going to be climate catastrophe and we'll all be dead in 30 years. But you've still got to pick your kid up from school. You
Yeah,
still
yeah.
got to, so we need a certain degree of cognitive dissonance in order to survive. Um,
Mm,
and in this case, it's just an extreme case of that. I think well, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's a pathology. Right? It's not just
mm,
a normal degree of cognitive dissonance. It's a pathological one. And
mm.
they will take the idea that they are sitting or getting great treatment at an Israeli hospital in Tel Aviv, and they will turn it round to the horror going on in Gaza and say, hey, 30 kilometers down the road, there's a first world health system. And the Israelis
Yes, yes.
aren't letting the Palestinians into it. So,
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
that is weaponized.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah. But I just find it amazing. But anyway, the let's talk now a bit more about, you know, what people want out of news and the role of news in society. So first of all, um, let's talk about the internet because both you and me are involved on the internet. So the internet means that people can spread their views without their comments being checked for facts. People can spread lies about Israel or any number of other subjects at all. And the internet can be used even by organizations such as the United Nations and Amnesty International to spread lies under the cover of some kind of legitimacy. So let's take off our rose-tinted glasses and talk about internet, pre-internet and post-internet. Was it a golden age before where there was more precision in news? If so, to what extent? Uh, and has there been a genuine decline in facts since the spread of the internet?
I think it's the latter for a variety of reasons. There was never a golden age of journalism. Um,
Mm,
uh, it's it's always been something where there are tabloids and there are non-tabloids and there are quality papers and non-quality papers and there are right-wing papers and left-wing papers. And this has been true since the printing press.
yeah.
Yeah. It really has. What? changed with the internet, though, is their business model. There was a golden age of journalism from a publisher's point of view, or a newspaper
Mm.
proprietor's point of view. Is in the 1980s, the London Sun made £1 million a day, to give you an idea. Um, yeah, that must be the easiest money anybody has ever made. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. But and the business model, which served the media for the better part of a century, was basically you sell newspapers very cheaply or at an affordable rate, and then with that audience, you take that audience and you offer it to advertisers, and this worked incredibly well. Now, when the internet came along, it messed that up in two ways. The
Mm.
first way it messed it up, my earphones keep falling out. I'm sorry. Um, it messed that up in two ways. The first way was that advertisers decided that they were better to advertise online, that they could reach their target directly without having a newspaper as an intermediary. Um, they could target their audience with much more precision than you can with a newspaper. And with kind of cost per click metrics and things like that, they could sort of pay for ads that worked and not pay so much for ads that didn't, where it's a bit like just shooting at a target and hoping when you advertise in a newspaper. So the business model shrunk, and as a result of that, resources shrunk. Uh,
Yeah.
then the other big change that happened was it also changed the flow of information. It disintermediated it. So what used to happen is a government used to announce something. So say, a central bank announce interest rate changes, and everyone says, what does that mean for my mortgage? Because that's the only part of interest rates newspapers seem to care about, and never mind anything else. But these days, they would hold a press conference, the news journalists would report it, they would publish it, people would read it. What happens now is that process still happens, but the central bank publishes that information itself. It will publish it on its own website. It will publish the press conference directly, so you can actually watch that press conference and don't need to rely on the journalists to do it anymore. So the
Mm.
journalist's role as a distributor of information is now redundant. So this is the problem. The newspaper said, well, people don't need to read what we're writing anymore, and we do not have the budgets to have big newsrooms anymore. So the way they tried to address that was they stopped reporting news and they started pushing more into analysis, commentary, which is what much of many newspapers today are. The problem with that is journalists are really, really bad commentators. I shouldn't say that, seeing I'm a journalist who became a commentator, but the skills that make a good analyst are not the same skills that make a good journalist. So
Mm.
as a result of that, people began writing more and more analysis, which was not anywhere near as good as it could have been had they gone out and just hired professional analysts to begin with.
Yeah.
So that started reducing the quality. The smaller newsrooms reduced the quality because workloads on journalists became higher and higher. So the amount of output they had to produce didn't change. There were just fewer people to do it because there were no longer budgets. And then technology hit them on the head with a hammer. It turned everything into 24-hour news.
Mm.
Um, and then everything has to be written now. So even if you are a weekly newspaper like The Economist, it's
Mm.
still updating things on its website and its app every single day. Uh, so everyone now has to be doing things at least daily, if not real time. And that's put another pressure on journalists who
Mm.
already stretched, already writing
Mm.
things they don't necessarily know very much about. And now they don't have as much time to write a good story. They've got to get it out now because everything's the 24-hour news cycle. So all these things combined are a recipe for news quality to deteriorate.
Let me pick up on the word you said about story, because I've heard that a lot from Superman to just now from Nachum, that journalism is about finding a story, which links in my mind with the word narrative, which links with my mind with the word making stuff up to make it sound good with a beginning, middle, and end. So we could say that the whole world is about narrative, finding facts to suit your opinion.
Hmm.
But wasn't journalism always about finding stories?
It was always about finding stories, and it was always about narrative. I mean, if you go back and read about the origins of the BBC, one of the reasons the BBC was created was to create a national narrative. So when new
Mm,
technologies of radio and television came in, governments were scared that the private sector would come in and there'd be all kinds of different things out there, much like we have now, and there wouldn't be any kind of social cohesion because everybody would be reading something different. So that was part of
mm,
the BBC's mandate since its creation, is to establish um, a narrative. But narrative, in itself isn't bad. If you have a narrative that is built on the facts, that's perfectly reasonable. It's when you
mm,
have a narrative built on the many voices in your head that it doesn't come up so well. So narrative has always been there. Has it gotten worse? I think it has, and I think social media is largely responsible for it. It's because there's just so many more people contributing to what the narrative is now. So
mm,
basically, the politicians would set a narrative, the limited number of journalists who knew the politicians and the limited number of media outlets
mm,
would report. They were shaping the narrative. Now you and I can shape the narrative. Some some teenager uh, can get a video to go viral with an AI picture of something. There's so many more people connecting to the narrative now. And whenever there's so many people building the narrative, it just has to fragment. It's almost
mm.
a law of mathematics. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's what's happened.
let's talk about the BBC. I don't want to legislate the whole point about BBC bias and so forth. I want to actually, you said something interesting in your article, which was that you said that the Guardian and the BBC are both biased, but I prefer the Guardian because I know it's biased, whereas the BBC pretends to be impartial. Now, I can see what you're saying, but I have to just put this to you. Isn't what you've said proof that we actually do need public service broadcasters? Because all the other institutions, such as the Guardian, as you say, has to be asking for money for donors, despite its small readership. So the only way it can do that is by appealing to ideological owners. But whereas the BBC is a little bit liberated from the fact of having to conform its views to the audience because they have to pay by law, they are independent from the government. And that presumably, I don't know, may apply in Australia and other countries where there is a public service broadcaster. So is our issue the staffing of the BBC or public service broadcasters? Or are you actually claiming that we'd actually be better to have lots of little guardians where everyone just says their own biased thing? I mean, is the BBC model, if staffed better, more conducive to actually having some regard for the truth?
10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would have advanced that precise hypothesis because theoretically that is the case. I would agree with all of
Mm,
that, except I'm also an empiricist. And empirically, it has not produced impartial journalism. And you can look at publicly funded journalism anywhere in the world, but they are almost outside of maybe like Hungary or Russia, they are almost all left leaning. And that's regardless of the way they're funded. So in Australia, they're government funded directly. So the money just comes out of Treasury. And there's all the fights about that. There's not a license system and a royal charter and the kind of things that the BBC has. So I would agree with you in theory, but if that theory is true, we shouldn't be in the mess that we are in now.
But is the issue the public service broadcasting, or is the issue a separate point which you make in your article that many of these people come directly from university, unlike in the past where there were cadetships,
Hmm.
that now they come directly from university with a pre-formed worldview, as opposed to in the past where they found out about the world on the job, and that therefore the problem isn't, well, I put it to you, that the problem is not public service broadcasting per se, but the influence of university on our society. So perhaps we are kind of pointing our guns in the wrong place, because at the end of the day, isn't the BBC and the Australian equivalents a way to deal with the issue of consonance, and the people are just, the media organizations are matching their news to audiences? If there was a greater diversity of people in universities and then therefore in public service broadcasting, there would be a more balanced news. Isn't that the real problem?
Uh, yes. So I would sort of make 2 points to that. So the first about the university and the staffing, I lay much of the blame for this at the universities. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that a lot of this comes from there. There isn't any doubt about it. The other issue is accountability. Uh,
Mm,
is once you've made it independent, but who is it then accountable to? So it's independent. It's not accountable to shareholders the way a private company would be. It's supposed to have a wall between itself and the government and the bureaucracy. So in theory, they're not accountable to them. They're accountable to themselves. The way I would fix it is I would elect the chair.
yes, that's a good idea. But again, now, are you conceding or not conceding that the issue is university, but also accountability? I agree with that. The enforcement of these charter obligations or the equivalent in other countries, or is the greater issue the public broadcasting itself? Because I'm concerned about people just listening to what they want to listen to.
Uh, no, I think public service broadcasting has a role, but
Mm,
it does need to be kept in check. So
yeah.
you look at public broadcasting around the world, it has a variety of functions. So one isn't just to be impartial, one is to protect a local culture. So, for example,
Mm,
if you are New Zealand and you're an English-speaking country, it's very hard not to be swamped by media from, say, the United States, and there will be no local industry around
yeah.
television whatsoever. So, they put money into it, or they put minimum local content requirement legislation in place. So public media serves that function as well, with what I call sort of, protecting culture.
Mm.
What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
But that we could about enforcing the charter obligations. So that's the main
Ah,
issue here.
yes. Uh, so how would you enforce them? I would hold them up to election. So,
You
if
said
they're,
that
if
was a
they're
good
no good,
idea. Yeah.
if they're no good, get them out. I don't have a precise mechanism for, whether who would become a candidate for that. Then the other
Mm,
role is also was to give voices to people who don't normally have voices. And that's kind of one of the
mm,
other roles of public service journalism. So in Australia, for example, there's if you watch commercial news and you watch the ABC, which is our equivalent to the BBC, there's much more stories about rural Australia on the ABC that nobody
mm.
in the private sector is interested in. So
Yeah.
they would argue that's a social good. The counter argument people make is if nobody wants to watch it, why are you making it? And if nobody wants to watch it, why are you spending taxpayer dollars on something nobody wants to watch?
Yeah. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah. But yes, but my concern with the asking the question is what you said about consonance, which is that deciding what's newsworthy is what basically what the people want, and the individual market that the people want. And so what you're having is people are just listening to what they want to listen to. In fact, it's worse than that, because, for example, if you take my case, I suppose you will say that I'm on a pro-Israel side of it, but I don't just want to watch news about Israel. I want to learn about philosophy and history and God knows what. But it's so directed and marketed is modern news that I try with all my might to find something out about history, but all my newsfeed wants to talk about is Israel. So you can't escape it, even if you are minded to have a diversity of news. And this is the problem. So that's why I was talking about public service broadcasting, because otherwise, how are we going to get out of this doom spiral of people just listening to what they want to know instead of trying to engage in a real search for the truth?
Yeah. So it's very, very difficult. You're correct. I don't have a simple solution to that. I do think that the issue of the universities and who was going into journalism and then who was training these journalists is a bigger issue than how the media funds itself. I think how the media funds itself is a really big issue. Um,
Yeah.
but it's almost a philosophical issue. It's almost a philosophical issue on what you feel the role of government in a society should be. It's kind of as fundamental as that. You'll find that
Mm.
libertarians do not want public service broadcasting, not because there's a problem with them, but because it challenges their philosophical beliefs. Whereas the more immediate problem is who gets hired and who gets trained and who's coming out of these universities. Um, I did.
But perhaps that's the problem, Nachum.
It
Perhaps
is.
that's the because I think we focus on the media because it's our media week and you're a journalist. But perhaps the media, perhaps we're kind of being a little unfair that we say it's the media the problem. Perhaps there are two other problems which are far more important than the media. The audience, the people who are just sucking up, just want to know things that they want to know. And B, as you say, the staffing of the universities. The media, even if it wanted to be noble, has no financial incentive to do so. That's the problem.
I mean, the way a newspaper could get around it is just
Okay.
not employ these people.
Mm.
You just employ
Yeah.
somebody and train them yourself. You don't have to go through the universities to do that. But,
Mm.
we've convinced ourselves that there is sort of a minimal requirement to be a journalist, uh,
Mm.
educationally. And I argue strenuously that that's not true because it wasn't true a generation ago, and the job hasn't really changed. So some of the blame does rest in newspapers because they're not producing these people, but they are hiring them and they are training them.
They
Um,
are. But then if they didn't hire them and train them and they didn't cater to the audience, no one will buy their newspaper. So even if I wasn't, I'm just basing this on what you said in your article, even if I don't do the cadetships, I don't hire anyone from the university, I am a philosopher with a love for wisdom who wants to search out the truth, I'm going to end up bankrupt. And so is this that we need, that we're in a spiral that we need news, we need a diversity of news so that we can try and get a bit nearer to what's true. But we can't get to that because we need to, before the people who are uneducated and don't know anything about the news will need to buy it. So we're kind of in a
yeah,
vicious circle.
yeah, that's true. I mean, journalism is about facts, not truth. If you want
Okay.
if you want truth, you can go to the philosophy department.
Yeah, but you say that, but I mean, the point is that there's so many facts to take the Middle East.
Yeah,
Me and you, we could provide a convincing argument for every single party in this conflict with facts because there are so many facts.
true. Yeah,
So
yeah.
surely it's about the diversity in a good way, an intellectual diversity, people from different backgrounds who can provide different perspectives. So we get different real facts, but we get a diversity of facts.
Hmm. Yeah, and people who would connect the facts together, perhaps in a
Mm,
different narrative, because they see the world differently.
mm.
So what is the solution?
Well, it's university, not to get
It
too off the subject,
no,
but
it is. It
um,
is.
not university is harming our society, isn't it? And I'm not just talking about media. There are many other issues which perhaps would be interest to you as a financial
Yeah.
person, but we're not going to go there. Otherwise, we could be here. But we're kind of raising the bar from people so they cannot enter entry level jobs. And this could be a separate debate,
Yeah.
minimum wage and so forth. But that we, by making everyone go to university, not only are we exposing people to a lack of diversity of views, but we are kind of we're making it we're kind of we're making sure that people are only coming from certain backgrounds, and even if it's a job which has got nothing to do with politics, we're kind of stopping people from poor backgrounds more and more getting into higher professions. And so this is the big problem, isn't it, in our
Yes.
society? This is
Yeah.
what really needs to be reformed.
It is an enormous problem. Is I mean, I think I make the point that journalism, to my knowledge, I'm sure there are others, but it's only one that I know intimately. It's the only industry that I can think of where the more educated journalists have become, the worse their output has become. I'm sure it's
Mm.
supposed to be the other way around. Um, you know, I
Well, how about politics? I mean, we
well,
had John Major as our prime minister. He didn't even go to university. Do you know something? He left school at 16 years of age, and he tried his one job interview was for a bus conductor, and he didn't get the job. But then he became prime minister. So, it just shows you this university is barring people. I mean, we're going off the subject, but I think it's related to we having a lack of diversity in society, lack of intellectual diversity.
yeah, that's absolutely true. And the other point about you talked about the university system needing reforms. It needs
Mm,
really major reforms. The 3 or 4 year degree is a relic in this day and age,
mm,
and the kind of jobs that we have in a post-industrial economy is, and in particularly as AI comes along, where I
mm,
can foresee vast numbers of jobs where it's going to be AI assisted, and you probably
mm.
need to do a 1 year degree or a 1 year qualification to do that job. And we're
Yeah,
still demanding people do a 3 or 4 year degree in some topic that isn't a real topic, like media studies or anything with studies in it. Actually, is not a real topic. Media studies, Asian studies. I have no idea what that means. Um, I have no idea whatsoever. What does Asian studies mean?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're
Is it
totally
history?
right.
Is it politics? Is it language? I haven't got the slightest.
Mm. But I think
Um,
this is the debate we've got to have in society,
yeah.
definitely. You talk in your article about an era where US journalism in particular was of high quality, where opinion and comment was strictly for opinion and comment columns. Today, most news is opinion, and we even have organizations like United Nations and Amnesty International, which are not providing impartial information. So, if you had to give an advice to a young person about where they could rely upon for their information, where can they rely upon for their information? And if you can't think of an answer to that, what are the consequences for our society for the decline in agreed facts and agreed knowledge, including from the media?
So I would phrase it a different way. So, I mean, the short answer to the question is you just need to talk to an enormous number of people. You can talk to the
Mm,
UN, but you need to talk to the critic of the UN. Um, so
yeah.
you've got to go really, really wide. And then the second question is what constitutes a balanced story or balanced coverage? So if we get the guy from the UN talking and we get a guy from who's a critic of the UN and we quote him, is that a balanced story? Maybe, maybe not. There's a vast number of other factors that make a story valid. Um, Having people from both sides doesn't really help you. You know, you can have Hitler talking from the right and Stalin from the left, and you're not going to have a balanced newspaper. You're going to have quite an extremist one.
Yeah.
And then you've got who you choose to quote and whether they are in a position to know, which is the issue that we have, in terms of what's going on in Gaza. Who are you going to trust? Is that person in a position to know? Uh, Experts have come in for a lot of flack lately, but obviously experts need to carry more weight than non-experts. There's all these other factors that are required for a story to be fair and balanced, rather than just giving a voice to both sides. But because
Mm,
it's so often seen as just giving a voice to both sides, you end up with complete quacks getting
mm,
equal kind of coverage. The Flat Earth Society guy is being quoted in the name of of
mm,
impartiality and both points of view. And you know, and that's just madness. And the real world consequences of that are enormous because you know now we have Hamas being quoted as a credible source, you know, as opposed to democratic Israel. So at least on Israel's side, if they start telling lies and doing nonsense, which no doubt they do, but there's a democratic society to call that out, right?
mm,
There's an opposition party to call that out. There's a free press to call that out. So, you know, just
mm,
that process makes it um, more credible than than the other way. The other good thing that readers can do, I think, which is not done enough in the internet age, is reading local news is just a fantastic thing to do. Um, you know, if you want to know what's going on in the Middle East, you're better off finding English, depending on your language skills, but you're better off reading Israeli newspapers, reading Arabic newspapers. I mean, a lot of Arabic newspapers, they kind of fall into two groups. There are ones that are just completely hostile to Israel, and you know, then there's kind of the intelligent end of the street who have pretty good arguments to make. Um, I don't know why that is not done more, and I don't know why foreign journalists don't pick up on that more either.
mm.
And example I always so I'm actually writing another piece at the moment on Judea and Samaria, um, and and all of that, and it's covered extensively in Hebrew and Arabic press, in Palestinian press, in Hebrew press. It's covered really extensively. So it isn't there really is a back and forth of violence there. So it's published in the newspaper. Any foreign correspondent can look at it and pick it up and look at who's in it and see if they can go and talk to those people themselves. But they don't do it. They just pick the one that fits the narrative. So they'll pick the violence from the Israeli settlers, which, there is no doubt that is going on. But that's all that will get reported. So one way is to try to bypass the international press and actually root things locally. Now, you never used to be able to do that. Now you really can.
Yeah, that's good advice. Good advice. But I suppose you've talked about impartiality. What is impartiality anyway? And what's the duty of the media? So, just to give you an example, in Zimbabwe, when you had Robert Mugabe, there was no doubt that the BBC was against Robert Mugabe, as were 99.99% of the population. Now, because there was a unanimity that Robert Mugabe was doing bad things and stealing properties and taking over white-owned farms, there was no doubt that they weren't being impartial, but they wasn't seen in a bad light. Now, they could have said, you could have had someone from Robert Mugabe's government saying, look, these were white settlers, they were colonialists, they were brought here by the British, they shouldn't be here. You could have got that same argument that Palestinians often use against Israelis. But no one did that, and I'm fine because I'm against Robert Mugabe. I don't mind that. But nonetheless, they breached their duty of impartiality. So that raises the question, is it okay not to be impartial in terms of Russia, in terms of Zimbabwe? Is that okay because there is such a unanimous belief that the Putin and Mugabe are in the wrong? So where does the impartiality come in as a journalistic duty? Do we only have to be impartial about Israel and the Palestinians because people are divided on the issue, despite the fact that one is run by jihadis? And what's your view on that? I think that's quite an interesting question.
So yeah, what is the role? What is the role of the media, and what duty does it have to be impartial? I kind of think that there's two ways that you can be impartial, one which is acceptable and one which is less acceptable. So the acceptable way to be impartial is just report the damning facts, right? If the facts are damning, they will speak for themselves and there'll be no need for you to take a side. Um,
Hmm.
So, if farmers are being driven off their land, and actually we're getting a version of this in South Africa at the moment. There's a row going on over uh,
Of
white
course.
South Africans seeking asylum in the US. Um,
Yeah.
so if you can just lay out the facts and those facts are damning, you can very nicely take a side and still have respected journalistic norms because the facts will tell the story for you. If you sit down and write a polemic, and I should be careful here because I really am a polemicist, uh, that's not quite as impartial. So I kind of draw that distinction. And so the really good journalism, the facts will tell the story for you, and
That's interesting,
you don't
Nathan.
have to
Yeah.
do it.
That's very interesting. In fact, and perhaps what do you, I mean, I'm watching, I don't know if you've watched, there's a Netflix documentary about the Vietnam War. And when you see how brave the journalists were then, some of the American journalists who really were inside Vietnam and really did put their lives on the line, and without their fact finding, no one would have known what was happening in Vietnam. Well, perhaps that's an additional point, isn't it? That if they are finding facts firsthand, and they report them, they don't have to then, further to what you're saying, they didn't have to say America good, as North Vietnamese good, doesn't matter. We were there, you're not telling us this. This is what happened in this village in Vietnam. In Gaza, they're not doing that.
No.
Perhaps that's a key difference.
And Gaza, it's the easiest, from a journalist point of view, it's the easiest war to write about. Uh,
Yes.
it's the easiest war to write about, particularly if you base yourself in Jerusalem. You can sit there and say, "Oh, we're 3 miles from the front line."
Yeah.
But the front line is nothing, right? The front line is just a road, and you cross the road, and they're speaking Arabic, and on the other side of the road, they're
Yeah.
speaking Hebrew, and they're all shopping, they're all buying stuff in each other's shops anyhow. Uh, that's the front line, but enables you to sit there and do that. Now, if you were writing on the war in Afghanistan, you don't get that kind of luxury, right? You've got to get out there in the mountains. You've got to get close enough to the Taliban who are going to kill you to be able
Mm.
to report that story. So the Israel Gaza story almost attracts a certain kind of wannabe foreign correspondent, and there's a certain cachet in journalism to being a foreign correspondent. It's an obscure kind of fame. Um, photo Photographers are even worse. There's a even more kind of subset of obscure
Mm.
fame within journalism that war journalists think that they have. So I think it almost attracts that kind of journalist as opposed to those who really want to see what's going on, which is, incredibly difficult, incredibly dangerous, psychologically very damaging.
Very good. Yeah. I'm just going to ask you two more questions. I know we're running a bit over time, but I hope the audience will forgive us because this is like a unique opportunity. You didn't talk about it in your piece, but I'm interested in the idea of the photos and images and photojournalism. Because we talk, for example, about the BBC, it's quite obvious to me that the radio BBC is far more reasonable. I'm not saying that they don't have some level of bias, but it definitely is far infinitely more reasonable than the website or the evening news. Why? Because there are no images, and you can't just show in images of people suffering, and that's the end of the argument. And more generally, in newspapers, the power of an image. Let's just forget about the fact that you can make images by AI or that you can import an image from Iraq and say that was from Gaza. Even if they're all 100% credible, suffering doesn't give context or history or explain anything. Is it time to say goodbye to photojournalism?
uh, they will never say goodbye to photojournalism because it's the one of the few parts of wire journalism, like Reuters or Associated Press, that is profitable. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, so that will never go just for that reason. Now, radio is a really interesting medium, actually. That radio has survived fascinates me. I'm not quite sure how or why, but it definitely has. Uh, you don't have a lot of time to waffle on radio because you have to describe things. So often, if you watch a sports match and listen to a sports match, when you're watching it, you can see what's happening, and the commentators don't have much to say, so they fill it in with gibberish. Or they fill
Yeah.
it in with their own opinion and their own speculation. Whereas on radio, you've got no capacity or space to do that. So all the space is filled up describing things. So the whole format is a little friendlier to facts in that regard.
Mm.
It's also quite hard to write radio journalism, much harder than you would think. We take so much of what we see for granted. It's like 70% of our cerebral cortex is devoted to visual image processing. So we're very picture people. So you have to write very carefully to get your message across with just words. So it's quite a high form of journalism, I would argue. Uh,
Yeah, I
do,
think so too.
yeah, do,
Mm.
do we do away with photos? Well, it will never happen, but your point is absolutely right. Um, you get a photo of a starving kid, even if that kid, even if it's 100, even given the benefit of the doubt, and the photograph is absolutely bona fide, that there really is a starving kid that they have photographed, but it tells you nothing about, is that the only starving kid on the block? Um, is he starving because of a blockade? Is he starving because he's just been vomiting for days because he's just finished a course of chemotherapy for his cancer. There have been bone thin cancer patients used in Gazan propaganda
Mm.
to show the starvation allegations. So it doesn't tell you any of those things, but you can't get the image out of your head. You, you,
Absolutely.
you cannot get the image out of your head. And it's interesting that you referenced the Vietnam War. I mean, that's why they started embedding journalists in militaries was, we're not going to let the journalists in this time. Uh, we're going to control where they go and where they
Yeah.
don't go. And you saw that in the first Gulf War. In the first Gulf War was the most successful military media management campaign I've ever seen. They had all the journalists in this big kind of tent in the desert. And,
Mm.
you don't know whether you remember it, but, Norman Schwarzkopf, the American general who was running the campaign, was sort of Mr. Charisma himself.
Mm.
And they just swallowed what the Americans were telling them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the only ones who were in the field were embedded with American troops. And it's pretty hard to be embedded with troops and then go and write bad things about them,
Yeah.
then have to go and be embedded with them the next day again. And a very difficult thing for a human being to do. You're going to be ostracized very quickly.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'm just going to do one more. I'd love to sit here talking for another 3 hours, but I suppose we have to be fair to the viewer. So I'm just going to just ask one question. I suppose we should end on a positive, or we don't have to be positive, but it's about the future of democracy. Because in your piece, you end it by talking about how essential high quality journalism is for the future of our democracy. Is this a dream, given the economic incentives to go against the facts, or is it possible? And
I
if it's not possible, has democracy got a future?
uh, I think it's possible. I'm still optimistic for a variety of reasons. We are really in a state of technological flux in the media.
Mm.
We haven't had this kind of flux since the printing press was invented. When the printing press was invented, the first thing it was used for was for witch hunts and pogroms and to whip them up. That was the very first thing it was used for. It wasn't really started being used to spread Calvinism, for another 100 years after that. So we're kind of in that window where we're still doing the witch hunts and the pogroms, and we haven't gone out of it yet. So, there may be a maturity about it that may follow. There is also a chance that the market itself can sort this out. Um, enough people will say, I've had enough of this. I'm not going to read this anymore. Now we're starting to see it with the way people vote, particularly in Europe. We're seeing, a return of the right. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but it is people saying, look, I've had enough of this. Whether they're choosing the right alternative is another question. So,
mm,
there is a hope that it can self-correct in that regard. Am I optimistic that that will happen? I try to I try to avoid making predictions.
mm,
I shouldn't be scared of it because you can never be wrong about a prediction you'd never be wrong about the future in the present, right?
mm.
So you can say whatever you like. So I think those are the reasons for optimism. If you have a little bit
Yeah,
of confidence that you and I are having this conversation because, we care about it. Uh,
yeah,
and, it's not just you and I. Now, the future of democracy is a much, much bigger question than just the media's role in it.
mm,
That
yeah, of
that's
course.
another topic. That's another
Yeah,
topic again. Democracy is an incredibly unnatural system of government. It's a very unique, specific set of cultural and historical circumstances that
mm,
created it in certain parts of the world, which is why it's so difficult to recreate in other
yeah,
parts of the world. Um,
yeah,
so there, that's a more complex question as the demographics and cultural beliefs of societies change. Will they
yeah.
value democracy in the same way, regardless of what the media is doing? And that's a whole other topic. That's a doctoral thesis, actually.
Yeah. Well, don't worry. We're trying to deal with it on my Substack bit by bit, the issue of democracy. Well, thanks. Hopefully your optimism is the exception to the rule that journalists aren't good at predicting things. So, but I hope that this conversation, thank you for being here, Nachum, but I hope that this conversation is part of that process of saying, no, we're going to draw a line here. I do feel that since October the 7th, we haven't just slipped back into the normal where everyone demands a ceasefire. That's the end of it. We have a ceasefire. We have quiet for another 2 years, and then we just have round 25. Instead, people are drawing a line in the sand, and that's why you're seeing greater extremism being exposed from some international organizations. But I think this is part of our are stopping that. I don't know if people have reached this point in the video, but if they have, I thank you for being with us.
They've
Is there
all
anything you
watched till
want
the
to add
very
before
end.
we
I don't
go?
know what you're talking about. They've all watched to
They've
the
all watched
very
it.
end.
John, hi. But yeah. But anyway, thanks, Nachum, and it's been a pleasure. And it's been a pleasure doing this week with you, which I hopefully we have made into an event, and hopefully this video, even if not necessarily viewed a lot at first, will hopefully it's going to stay up on the internet and will in time be seen.
And
Hopefully,
that's actually a very good point. Is that one of
yeah,
the reasons it's important to write these things? Is that when people go back and try to look and understand what happened, that
yeah,
these voices are there as well. So, it's not just
yes,
people now we need to speak to. We need to have that for the historical record too. Yeah. So thank you.
absolutely.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm a big fan of your Substack. I have encouraged my readers to subscribe to it, and maybe you can write one for moral clarity sometime.
I hope so. I'll be in touch with you about it now. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye bye.